Hello, AP World History students. Mr. Lassiter here with you. And in today's live stream, we are going to be reviewing for the midterms, perhaps, that you have. It's our fall semester review. We are going to cover a lot of information today. Starting right about now, we're going to go hopefully fit it in an hour, but we'll be here to answer questions probably way past that time. I have a lot of information to cover. A couple things to let everybody know right off the bat. This is, of course, production of Fiveable. Make sure that you join us for all of our live streams, our free live streams. Consider joining Fiveable if you want access to a lot of our older streams. Pretty much everything I'm going to be talking about and reviewing tonight and going over as reminders, we have full length, some 45 minutes, hour and 15 if you were me and went way over time in your streams. But we have these full length streams that really dive deep into these topics. So if there's anything that you're unsure about, we have it for you. We're going to be taking a look at units 1 through 4. So basically the years 1200 to 1750 in today's stream. And we'll try to move quickly for you. I'm going to be kind of churning along. Don't hesitate to ask questions, though. We have some teachers in the chat that'll be happy to answer your questions. You can pose them in the chat, or you can pose them as a question. If you click the Ask a Question button, we can get an answer for you, give you a little bit more information while I'm going. I have a lot of notes for this. I will make sure to add some of my talking points and the slides themselves to the resources when we are finished tonight. So let's go ahead and start thinking about why we're here. Is the fall semester review. If you want to connect with me, you can do so on Twitter, on Facebook at Wapters. Of course, here on Fiveable is the best place as we do these live reviews so that we can communicate with you. Of course, we keep our library there so that you can go back and have these materials on demand. Well, we're going to review the course layout a bit, and actually that's what the rest of these bullet points are. We are thinking about the years 1200 to 1750. Perhaps in your classes, you looked at the world before 1200 as kind of background context, and certainly there are some things in this first unit that stretch before the year 1200, but we're going to really focus on these key concepts. The units are laid out into 4 categories. The first one is what we call the global tapestry. So we're going to just talk about developments across the globe by region tonight. Then we will look at networks of communication and exchange, otherwise known as trade networks, from the years 1200 to 1450. Then we will shift our attention to Unit 3 and talk about land-based empires from 1450 to 1750, followed up by the first global era, this era where we have global trade occurring in our world. So we are going to focus mainly on reviewing kind of big ideas. I'll throw some details in there. I am not, for sake of time, going to be able to go into a lot of explanation, but if you have a burning question, we can come back to that at the end and spend a little bit longer on some of these topics. As Samuel L. Jackson says in Jurassic Park, hold on to your butts. Let's get moving. And we're going to start with thinking about developments across the globe. And we're going to be looking at these regions, East Asia, the Dar al-Islam, or the House of Islam, so the Islamic world in the Middle East, Africa, the Indian Ocean basin. We're going to then look at South and Southeast Asia, the Americas, Africa, and then we'll finish with Europe for this first unit review. So let's get started. Let's talk about East Asia. And we're going to start with thinking about China. So one thing that we see in this unit is that you need to know a little bit about empires in these regions and governmental systems, and one of the things is how do they rule their people? How do they maintain power? And so in China, you need to know some of the Chinese governmental systems. You also need to know some of the dynasties from the years 1200 to 1450. The ones you really need to focus on are the Song dynasty, which you see pictured here, the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol led dynasty in China, and then the Ming dynasty, the restoration of Chinese rule. And if you want more information on that, we actually have a video that I did, I think, way back in October, September sometime, which was China in the Global Middle Ages, where we go real in depth on these topics. But in terms of these dynasties and how they ruled, you need to understand that they used a bureaucracy, and that is government workers who served at the pleasure of the emperor. And China was known also for maintaining control through the use of one of its philosophical systems, and that is Confucianism. And Confucianism was all about relationships of father to son, husband to wife. But one of those relationships was ruler to subject, and the idea that the ruler would take care of the subject, and the subject was obedient to the ruler. And so that idea really permeated China and really laid a good foundation, a strong foundation, as far back as the Han Dynasty for this Chinese dynastic system. And Confucianism was the basis for the tests, the civil service exams, to become a bureaucrat, which was a very high-ranking position in China. And so people would study years and years for these Confucian exams. And if they passed them, they would become a bureaucrat who, again, answered to the emperor. And so that was a way to centralize control, a way to maintain control of China. And so when we think about China in governmental systems, we think about its use of Confucianism, the use of the Confucian bureaucracy, and civil service exams. Beyond that, Confucianism relates to another aspect of that we see in East Asia, especially China, and that is these cultural traditions of the Chinese. One of what I was describing there, relationship of father to son, ruler to subject, that is summed up in the idea of filial piety. Here you see it illustrated from a 12th century painting. But that idea that there are specific relationships, and to keep harmony in society, you would obey your superior and take care of your inferiors. Other cultural traditions that come about in China, or that see popularity in this time period, are Buddhism, which comes out of India into China and then spreads throughout China, gains a great deal of importance, and spreads out of China to the surrounding regions. A revival of Confucianism, known as Neo-Confucianism, is also important in this time period. It is significant to know that China's developments of Neo-Confucianism and the Confucian bureaucracy and Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism in China, is going to heavily influence its neighbors, especially Korea and Japan, and to some extent Vietnam, as China exerts influence over those regions at times. This is something that's maybe referred to in your courses as sinification. Some of these countries, like Japan, willingly accepted these things. They went and made reforms, or attempted reforms, to try to be more like China. And some were not so willing. Korea adopts them, and China treats it as a tributary state. Vietnam adopts some elements, but certainly does push back against China. As China spreads these ideas of Neo-Confucianism, Buddhism spreads. Something to understand in East Asia, because we're not just talking about China in this portion of the unit, but it is important to understand that cultural traditions that are found in China, like Buddhism, and are found elsewhere in East Asia, they are the result of a process of the spread of ideas. For example, the spread of Buddhism. And as Buddhism spreads, it adapts to the regions it spreads into. And so we see many different branches of Buddhism: Theravada Buddhism, or more strict Buddhism; Mahayana, the wide path of Buddhism, which really does adapt to local culture. For example, in China, the combination with ancestral worship and the creation of bodhisattvas. And then we also have Tibetan Buddhism, for example, on the Tibetan plateau. Now, if we want to shift our focus to economic systems and the ideas of commercialization and innovation in China, certainly this time period is a good one to think about it, especially with Song China. As trade grows throughout history, but especially in this time period, 1200 to 1450, we see that Song China is going to increase productive capacity. We see under the Song dynasty, for example, they expand the Grand Canal in China, which had been started by the Sui dynasty, was first expanded by the Tang dynasty, later expanded by the Tang dynasty, and then the Song expand on that even further. Also in China in this time period, in these dynasties, we see steel and iron production, the use of the increased production of textiles, like silk textiles, as well as porcelain. And those increases are not because of demands in China, but they are increases because of demands of outside places who want to trade with China. Other innovations that we see, we mentioned how China exerted control to the south in places like Vietnam. In return, they get an innovation in agriculture, a new strain of rice known as champa rice, which is a fast ripening rice, and provided much more food for China, which will again lead to population increases and then greater production within China itself. So that's kind of our big review of East Asia in this time period, thinking about governance in this region, thinking about cultural developments and interaction, and thinking about economic systems. And we'll think about some of these same things throughout. So kind of keep that in mind, where you see similarities, where you might see differences. The next place we want to turn our attention to is the Dar al-Islam. And that term simply means the house of Islam, and it includes basically the entirety of the Islamic world. Initially, just in the Arabian Peninsula, and then later in the caliphates, the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphate. But that idea of the house of Islam spreads even further. And Islam shapes societies around it. It shapes societies in Africa, in the east coast of Africa, through the Trans-Saharan Trade, into West Africa. It shapes the Indian Ocean in India and Southeast Asia, and it even shapes Europe. The Umayyads conquer Spain, and they hold on to the Muslim regions of Spain, remain until 1492 or so, when the Reconquista is completed by the Spanish. So there are going to be a lot of influences within this Dar al-Islam. Of course, we'll start by thinking about governance here, and the creation of Islamic states. So prior to the start of this time period, prior to the year 1200, there were large Islamic Caliphates, empires, particularly the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphates. But shortly after this time period begins, those Caliphates are fracturing. The Abbasid Caliphate is falling apart. The Mongols come in, conquer much of the region that belonged to it, and we end up seeing kind of in the end days of this fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate, even though there was technically still an Abbasid Caliph until he's killed by the Mongols, we see new states begin to emerge. And most of these are Turkic states, the Seljuk Empire, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. And we even see Islamic states develop elsewhere, Delhi Sultanates in India. But these Islamic states are going to use a governance based on the Islamic religion. These are very diverse places, typically. So that's something to keep in mind, too. We're not, in many ways, the Islamic world and these Islamic states in this time period are much more welcoming of outsiders. For example, when Jews are kicked out of Spain in our next time period, they find homes in the Ottoman Empire, for example. Of course, with these expansion of states, we see the expansion of Islam as well. Islam expanded many different ways. One, through military expansion in the earliest days of Islam, and then later on as subsequent empires grew. For example, the Ottoman Empire spreading Islam into southeastern Europe. But it also spread in other ways, in many of the same ways that Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism spread, and that is through merchants and trade. Islam spreads to East Africa through Indian Ocean trade routes. It spreads into West Africa through Trans-Saharan trade routes. It spreads into Central Asia through the Silk Roads. It also is aided by merchants, by missionaries in addition to those merchants. And also what you see pictured here, the development of a branch of Islam, Sufism, which focused on less on the kind of the dogmatic aspects of the religion or the rules of what you say and do and how you pray, and more on the mystical aspects of the religion. And that allowed Islam to adapt a little bit more as it moved. It is important to understand as well that the Islamic world, the Dar al-Islam, is extremely important in this first time period as a center of intellectual innovation and intellectual transfer. So innovations in things like mathematics, where Nasir al-Din al-Tusi invents trigonometry. It's a center for literature and medicine. The city of Baghdad is the center of knowledge in the world. It's basically the heir of Alexandria. When Alexandria crumbles, eventually makes its way to Baghdad as kind of being the center for knowledge, where all of this comes together. The house of wisdom is what we refer to it as. And in this Islamic world, in the Islamic world is where we see the preservation of Greek philosophy and commentaries on Greek philosophy. And later on, when the Renaissance comes about in Europe and they rediscover these texts and they rediscover this classical philosophy, they're getting all of that from the Islamic world. Also, the spread of scholarship and culture into Spain. So there is that interaction between the Islamic world and Europe, especially in Spain. So important intellectual innovations and transfers, and that's on top of technology transfers that reach that spread from Europe to the Middle East to Asia, and from Asia to the Middle East back to Europe. So our next section I want to talk about is South and Southeast Asia, and again, this is still want to think about. When we look at Southeast Asia, religion, or South and Southeast Asia, religion plays an important role. Whereas the Middle East and Europe are shaped by Judaism, Christianity, Islam, South and Southeast Asia are shaped primarily by Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism. That's what's shaping these regions. And so those are kind of the core beliefs, and their core beliefs and practices are shaping what's going on in those regions. Now, there are other beliefs and practices that come about and help shape these regions, things that might stand out regarding these religions in South and Southeast Asia. For example, the Bhakti movement in South Asia, Sufism, which we had just talked about as Sufi mystics and kind of moved throughout the Indian Ocean region, spreading Islam quite successfully. And with Buddhism, practices of monasticism, for example, help to shape these regions. So just kind of a couple things to keep in mind. Now, Hindu and Buddhist states emerge as well, just like we think about Islamic states emerging. So when you think about South and Southeast Asia, just kind of keep that idea in mind, that we're seeing Hindu states develop later on, and we see Buddhist states, especially in Southeast Asia, places like Srivijaya, Majapahit, these, and there's a whole other list. You may have learned about some of the other from here, and maybe our other teachers can chime in the chat with a little bit more information on them. But we do see states based around these ideas, and states building quite powerful empires centered on religious practice, religious belief. And you can see in the map that you have here on the page, the spread of Hinduism from India and its home to outlying areas, especially in Southeast Asia and here on in Indonesia and along the Malay Peninsula. It's quite significant. Oh, Eric, Mr. Beckman is calling me out. The Khmer Empire, don't forget about them either. So the let's see. Next, we're going to Americas. Man, it's a hard shift going from Africa, Eurasia to the Americas, but now we're going back to Africa and Europe. So I ordered it like the College Board. I should have mixed it up because this is a mind shift I'm having to make. Whereas we see state building in the Dar al-Islam, as we see it in East Asia, as we see it in South and Southeast Asia, it's also occurring in the Americas. So we don't want to forget that. A lot of times we think before 1450, the Americas, maybe we don't give enough time to them. Hopefully your teachers did in your class. There is a great diversity of experiences in the Americas, whether you're talking about Mayan culture, which declined somewhere around 9 to 1100 CE, highly urbanized cultures, advanced mathematics, astronomy. You might have heard about the Mayan calendar, of course. Mexica culture, or the Aztec culture, of Mesoamerica, highly advanced, again, highly urbanized empire built on conquest. Also, there's a great deal of trade through Mesoamerica with them, land-based trade. The Inca in South America are certainly important. But there are others. For example, Cahokia, which was a massive city centered around a religious kind of mound building center located in present-day Illinois, I believe. I don't want to get that wrong. Somebody can correct me. But in the Mississippian cultures of North America, we do see the same highly developed societies. And they were highly advanced and urbanized. Some of these images kind of show the skill of these people. I almost banned you, Eric. I pressed the wrong button. So they were highly advanced. In the top left picture on this, and I know I got to move more quickly, but we see the system of agriculture in the Aztec civilization with the use of chinampas. You see highly skilled artisanship of the Aztec or Mexican culture with this jade double-headed dragon. The Mayan calendar on the top right. Human sacrifice, which was important, which was one way the Aztec were able to kind of maintain control. They used religion as a way of controlling people around them. And the bottom middle and the bottom right images here showcase the advancement of the Incan culture. The road building throughout the Andes Mountains, which was highly advanced. They even used suspension bridges. And their method of record keeping, the use of the knotted system known as quipu. So some very highly advanced urbanized cultures there. They are not using the same type of iron. They're not kind of in the Iron Age yet, not using the same type of iron. So when the Europeans arrive and they're decimated by disease, they're also going to be decimated in war. And that's something we'll talk about later. All right, we're moving quickly here. I'm feeling pretty good about this. I hope everybody is. Again, if you have questions along the way, populate it down in the question area, and we'll definitely try to get to it. Hopefully, I'll cover it without having to answer it in advance, but definitely populate your questions down there. So let's turn our attention to Africa next and think about state building there, right? A lot. Again, this theme's coming up again and again, state building. And in Africa, we do see states flourishing in this time period, particularly those associated with trade. Of course, Ethiopia and East Africa had a long cultural tradition and traded with the Islamic world. But if we look outside of that, look at, like, for example, the Hausa Kingdom of West and Central Africa, or the Hausa, I think maybe how you say it. They developed control over trade routes going into North Africa, over the Trans-Saharan routes. In Southern Africa, Great Zimbabwe built an empire by controlling the ivory and gold trade. So they had abundant trade with goods on the Indian Ocean. And you can see they are located down here near the southeastern part of Africa. But they controlled the goods from the interior of Africa, moving to the coast and moving to the Swahili coast where they could be traded with the rest of the world. And if you were to have traveled to Great Zimbabwe in this time period, you would have seen goods from as far away as China and Southeast Asia and South Asia that had made their way to this region because of its importance in trade and its control of trade. Another empire that doesn't really fit right here, but does kind of fit in this time period is the Malian Empire in West Africa. Representation here with Mansa Musa of Mali. Trade kind of explodes after he brings loads of gold, something like 70 camels full of gold on his Hajj or pilgrimage to Mecca, really highlighting the riches of West Africa and expanding that trade. All right, Europe. Interestingly, we're not going to spend too much time here on Europe. Thinking about Europe, we want to consider religion as cultural influences. We want to consider governance and what it looked like here in kind of the tail end of the Middle Ages, and social organization. We'll start with just thinking about religion. Europe is highly influenced by Christianity. In Spain and some of the southern regions, maybe more so Islam, and of course, Judaism in pockets of Europe certainly influences culture there. But Christianity will be the main influencer in Europe throughout the previous time periods and still in this one. The Catholic Church dominated West and Central Europe, the Roman Catholic Church. During this time period. And it was really the one kind of unifying element in a Europe that was highly fragmented. You can see that in the map here, a map of France right around 1477, right near the end of this time period. Overall, Europe was basically broken down into decentralized monarchies and in a hierarchical system that we refer to as feudalism. So Europe being very feudal in this era. The social organization was mainly based around agriculture. Europe was highly agricultural. It depended on a combination of free and coerced labor that you can see here with serfdom in this image. And that was the main social structure of Europe. Leading up to the 1450s in the global era. At the end of the time period, parts of Europe are going to be pulling out of this. The Renaissance will begin in Italy, partially as a consequence of the Crusades, which occur in this time period as Europeans went and fought in the Middle East and began to reconnect with culture that and to reconnect with the Islamic world, and especially cultural elements that perhaps might have been lost. And so as the Renaissance comes along, Europeans are going to start thinking a little bit differently. Shortly after that, we're going to see the discovery of the Americas, and they're going to start thinking about possibilities. And then you'll have the Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution, and it'll throw us into kind of the early modern era. But here in 1200 to 1450, we're still seeing Europe as highly agricultural, not really looking outward too much. That will change in the next time period, and it will change drastically. All right. Keep your questions coming. We're going to try to get to them as much as possible. Again, you can add your question to the Ask a Question section as well, and get kind of a longer answer than something you might find in the chat. So don't be hesitant. That's what we're here for tonight. And that really, what we've just gone through, concludes in a relatively quick fashion, I'd like to say, Unit 1. But we're going to still have to speed up because I have a feeling we're going to end long. All right, Unit 2, networks of exchange, trade from 1200 to 1450. First thing with trade that you need to think about, you have to know your trade routes in this time period, particularly Silk Roads, Trans-Saharan Trade, Indian Ocean routes. Those are the most significant. And then also understand the Mongol impact on trade. That's what we're looking for. So the first one we're going to talk about are the Silk Roads. And the Silk Roads being overland trade routes see a revival in this time period. They're actually going to reach their height with trade under the Mongols. We're going to see trade expand. Some very powerful trading cities like Samarkand and Kashgar spring up along the Silk Roads. They are primarily concerned with trading luxury goods, those high value to low weight ratio goods like silk, for example, precious stones, other valuable items, and they'll be done in these large caravans in which you don't have people traveling the entire Silk Road all at once. Instead, what you have are this relay trade that occurs all the way across the Silk Road. To help with that, we have different forms of different innovations which come along. Caravanserai, for example, which connect, which allow kind of stopover rest places that are very safe for travelers between stops on the Silk Road. All other innovations like forms of credit make trade much easier. The development of money economies does the same thing. We even see the use of flying money or paper money in this time period. And of course, as people get a taste for these luxury goods that are traveling along the Silk Roads, especially in the 1200s and the 1300s, that demand will lead to an increased production of goods and even more trade. So kind of that positive feedback loop. As I said, the Silk Roads reach their height under the Mongols. The rise of the Mongol Empire is led by Genghis Khan, Chinggis Khan, spelled however many different ways it's transliterated. But the Mongol Empire reaches the status of being the largest contiguous land-based empire in history, as it stretched all the way from the Pacific into Europe and the Middle East. And Genghis Khan builds this empire by uniting many different tribes. He does that in a very systematic way through the use of the military and the Arban, through intermarriage. And his successors do carry this on. The empire eventually will split up. It's so large, it's a little untenable. And so we get kind of a new governance system known as the Khanate. And so the empire splits into the Golden Horde of Russia, the Ilkhanate of the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate of Central Asia, and the Yuan Empire, which is Kublai Khan's empire that features kind of the center of the Mongol beginnings, as well as the nation of, we can call it a nation, the state of China, which he conquers, and leading to the end of the Song dynasty and the rise of the Yuan dynasty in China. Now, how exactly do the Mongols facilitate trade along these Silk Roads? Well, they do that by just protecting trade. They are proponents of trade, and they facilitate trade and communication through protection, through issuing passports like the one you see here, some of which threaten death to anyone who impeded the person who held the passport. They improve communication with the use of arrow messengers. They offer protection for merchants throughout their empire. They knew the value of trade in a healthy empire, and so they promoted it. They were very they weren't an empire that cared too much about what religion you were. If you were promoting trade and submitted to the Mongols, then you were good to go. And under the Mongols, in this height of trade, there are significant cultural and technological transfers. We see Greco-Islamic medical knowledge move in all directions. It eventually transfers to Western Europe. Numbering systems that develop in South Asia and to the Middle East find their way to Europe. We see Islamic scholars share knowledge with China. Even I think it was Kublai Khan has I should have a picture of this. He has an astronomical observatory built in the style of Arabic observatories. And so we see a lot of movement in a lot of exchange of knowledge between these areas of the world. And maybe your teacher had you read or maybe pulled excerpts from the Mongols and the making of the modern world. So a lot of people credit them with this time period with really setting the stage for the first global era. Next trade network that you should be familiar with is the Indian Ocean trade. And I'm going to really try to go fast here because we have a whole presentation, I know, on most of these topics, but especially Indian Ocean trade, I know because I did that a ways back. So if you're looking for more information on the Indian Ocean trade than what we're going to give you, don't forget that you can go to that information. In this time period, 1200 to 1450, we see increased volumes of trade in the Indian Ocean, just like we see along the Silk Roads. We see an expansion of trade routes within the Indian Ocean. This is accompanied by new powerful trading cities and new trading states. On the east coast of Africa, you have the Swahili coast, so the Swahili city-states, which are important for trade in this region. In India, you have cities like Gujarat, which become an important region and source for trade. In Southeast Asia, Malacca, controlling the narrow straits of Malacca, established a powerful trading city that will remain powerful and important for a long time. Portuguese will eventually conquer it, knowing its importance to trade through that region. All of this expansion of trade in the Indian Ocean is aided by innovations in transportation and new knowledge. So there are larger ship designs like the junk ship, which become very common and help spread trade. The increased use of the navigational compass and the astrolabe help to make trips safer and more efficient. And knowledge of the monsoon winds, which had developed in previous time periods, that knowledge continues to spread, be refined, improved as far as trade goes to make these this trade network very efficient. Of course, the monsoon winds are seasonal winds, so we see people moving away from perhaps their homes and maybe sailing from India to the Swahili coast and staying there for months at a time. So what's really interesting is along the rim of the Indian Ocean, you get these really cosmopolitan cities develop with really interesting mixes of culture which is pretty significant. There's a lot of trade too that comes about in this Indian Ocean as all of these things are happening. So along the way, there are these cultural developments and interactions that I was just talking about, these diasporic communities, Arabs and Persians in East Africa, the Chinese trading in Southeast Asia, Malay communities all around the Indian Ocean rim. Culture is shared in these cosmopolitan trading cities. And just like we see along the Silk Road, we see technological and cultural transfers, whether it's the voyages of Zheng He, whether it is the movement of goods across the Indian Ocean. This is one of my favorite artifacts to bring up from the British Museum, the Kilwa pot shards, where we, on the beaches of East Africa, you can find pottery shards that were from as far away as China. Some of these pottery shards are from India, and some of them are from the Middle East, all found in East Africa. Just another example of the extent to which trade took place in this region of the world. We've already talked a little bit about some of the cultural transfers, the spread of Hinduism and Buddhism into Southeast Asia, so I won't rehash that. Somebody that you should take note of is perhaps specific voyages. The Chinese voyages in the Ming Dynasty of Zheng He into the Indian Ocean really draws China into the Indian Ocean for a time into trade, although they will recall his treasure fleets and will isolate themselves just before Europeans enter the Indian Ocean. There's probably more, but let's move on. Trans-Saharan routes. Not going to spend a ton of time on these. Silk Roads, Indian Ocean, the Trans-Saharan routes across North Africa are also very important. Trade was helped across the Indian Ocean by existing technologies, particularly the camel saddle and caravans that would move across the Sahara Desert, making connections in trade, particularly increasing volume through the time period. You particularly have salt being traded from the north into West Africa. That's the main good that we normally think about in exchange for gold, ivory, and slaves. So that's something to to remember is that there is just as much as East Africa is engaged in trade in the Indian Ocean, other regions of Africa are engaged in other types of trade. And the Trans-Saharan routes are land-based routes, of course, but are significant to know in this time period. So if we want to think next then about all of this trade, all of this interaction, what are the cultural and environmental consequences that we see here? What we ultimately see are increased cross-cultural interactions. We have a diffusion of art in this time period, a diffusion of literature. Religion continues to spread along these trade routes. We talked already about Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam moving along these routes, and science and technology as well. So keep those in mind. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is along the Silk Roads, gunpowder and paper spread from China into the Middle East and then eventually into Europe. And I don't know about you, I think those are fairly important, although I hope you only used one of those today. We also see this cultural interaction. We have a great number of records of this cultural interaction because of travelers in this time period. And there are a lot of these travelers that come up in AP World. Two of the ones that you probably heard most about are Marco Polo, Italian traveler from one of the Italian city-states. I can't remember which one. Travels to China and spends some time in the court of Kublai Khan and writes about it. People didn't even believe his stories for a time. They said there were the million lies, but he wrote about the Mongol Empire, and it's a valuable source for knowing about these cultures and those transfers. Another one, a Muslim traveler, a Moroccan traveler, Ibn Battuta, is extremely valuable, and I hope you've read some stuff from Ibn Battuta because he's one that likes to pop up on AP exams. Ibn Battuta writes about his travels throughout the Indian Ocean, across the Islamic world, on pilgrimage to Mecca. He travels to West Africa and writes about the empires there. He travels to East Africa. He travels to India. Just kind of keep these travelers in mind. And as Eric is mentioning here, Marguerite Kemp, and I'm not really good if I know that name. I've told people many times I've mispronounced that. So go check out Ms. Longnecker's presentation, and you'll get a little bit more information on travelers there as well. Now, other consequences, right? I said there were, social or cultural and environmental consequences. When we think about environmental consequences, it is the diffusion of crops, the spread of bananas, for example, from Southeast Asia to Africa, champa rice from Southeast Asia to East Asia, the spread of citrus into the Mediterranean. But probably most significant is the spread of pathogens and epidemic diseases along these trade routes, particularly along the Silk Roads. As the Mongols conquered the width of Asia, they increased trade. Well, along with people moving, move ideas, of course, but also move diseases. And so the Black Death or bubonic plague moves as well from East Asia into Central Asia, and eventually makes its way to Europe, where it decimates the European population. So trade, ultimately immensely good, but keep in mind, disease, it sucks. And I think that gets us to the end of period 2. So hopefully you've got a lot of questions down there. And hopefully we're doing a great job of answering. We got an incredible team here. A lot of these people answering questions, Melissa, Eric, Donald, and others if I haven't been paying attention too much in the chat. These are the people who are doing our live streams, who are providing this information for you. If you join up with Fiveable, you can get access to all the stuff they've been creating, just doing a really fantastic job of presenting this material. And I say that to give myself time to breathe and take a sip. All right. Unit 3. Unit 3 is focused all on land-based empires. And so again, that you can probably hear in there, it's empire. We're going to be talking a lot about expansion. We're going to talk a lot about administration and governance. But we will also be looking at how these empires used belief systems and religion to maintain control, and how some competition in these places also led to divisions. So first, let's talk about the expansion of land-based empires. In this time period, this occurs in large part thanks to that gunpowder I talked about a little bit ago. And so oftentimes we label some of these land-based empires as gunpowder empires. The Mughal Empire, for example, the Safavid Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, they kind of get this term gunpowder empires. And there are others too. You can look at the unification of Japan, and that's due in large part to the use of gunpowder. The gunpowder, cannons, armed trade, all of these things allow these empires to really expand control more easily than maybe what we had seen in the past. The ones to know, I've kind of mentioned some of them. In China, which you see pictured here, you see the Qing dynasty, which is ruled by the ethnic group, the Manchu. And the Manchu build this empire, and they are the second kind of outsider group to rule China. The first outsider group were the Mongols, and eventually they were kicked out. The Ming dynasty comes along, restores Chinese rule, but the Manchu take the opportunity of kind of a weakening of that Ming dynasty to come in and take control of China. And this will be our last dynasty in China. So it leads up to the 1900s when the dynasty falls in favor of the nationalists, and then later communism comes along. Within the growth of these states, as we see these states grow, and this is a good map, we'll return to it later, showing the Safavid Empire in Iran, and you can see on either side of it are other empires and other regions. So naturally, as empires grow, we're going to see conflict arise. Particularly, we see it between the Safavids and the Mughals, the Safavids and the Ottomans, and that's going to be a significant conflict that we'll return to momentarily. But these political and religious disputes lead to rivalries between these groups. Also in Africa, we see rivalries, for example, between the Songhai Empire with Morocco in North Africa. When we think about administration in these land-based empires, one commonality we see is the recruitment and use of bureaucratic elites, as well as the use of military professionals to rule over their empires. And so that's going to become much more common among rulers who really want to centralize control over their empire, centralize control over populations and resources, especially, and sometimes in trade routes and all those things. So this use of bureaucracy, which we see way back when in China, becomes very common in this time period. Some examples of the use of bureaucratic elites or military professionals: the Ottoman Devshirme system, Devshirme, the Devshirme system, which you see pictured here, where they draft non-Muslims and then educate them and train them for the military, and many times convert them along the way. In Japan, which again centralizes in this time period, and I know it's an island, but it's sort of a contiguous land-based empire, the use of salaried samurai to support the shogun of Japan. And so what that does is, of course, create more centralized control, and instead of the kind of relying on these maybe local rulers to help. And that is what we call decentralization, which weakens the power of a king or an emperor. Where are we at now? What did I bring this picture up for? Oh, administration. So not only do we see the use of these elites and the structure of governance, but we see some other ways that these empires become quite powerful. And one is bending culture to their will. and that is using religious ideas, using art, using architecture even to gain legitimacy. So, for example, if we think about religion, the Aztec or Mexica culture practiced human sacrifice and sacrificed people that they were conquering along the way. You're in Europe, we use the idea of divine right, the idea that God chose a family line or a bloodline to rule. As some exhaust is going on outside my home. I don't know if y'all can hear that. In the Songhai Empire of West Africa, they promote the religion of Islam to gain legitimacy among the people. So religion in this time and really throughout history can also be used as a tool for governance, just as the ideas of Confucianism were used in China. And art and architecture was used. Pictures, I mean, you see here the Taj Mahal on your left and the Palace of Versailles on the right. This monumental architecture displayed power, right? It displayed the wealth and power of leaders and gave them greater legitimacy. Art was used in the same way. The Qing Empire had imperial portraits where the Manchu are carrying on a Chinese practice to give them greater legitimacy. The Mughals build mosques and mausolea, like the Taj Mahal, which you see pictured here. The Incan Empire, which I know is kind of jumping across the pond here, they build the Sun Temple of Cusco. So it's quite significant when you see things like this being built. It's a statement of power, just as much as it's a pretty building that you want to visit. Went too fast. The last thing I want to mention here, I don't have a picture for it, is that in centralizing control through bureaucracy, through exhibiting your power, if you're like want to be an emperor and want to know how to rule, you also have to know how you get funds, and that comes through collecting taxes and trying to figure out what the best way is. When these empires break down, a lot of times they're in decentralization, turning to local leaders to collect taxes, and the local leaders are just saying, we won't give it to you. We'll just keep it for ourselves. So tax collection systems became very important. We see tribute systems develop in some regions, like in the Aztec culture. They, tribute lists that you find mention bird feathers and jade and textiles. Some use tax farming, like the Ottoman Empire used tax farming, where they have individuals kind of contracted to go out and collect amount of taxes, which can lead to abuse. The Romans used to use it. And then some use other methods. The Mughal Empire used zamindars to collect taxes. The revenue generated in this tax collection, of course, increases your power and allows your empire to further expand, or at least that's the idea, right? So when we're thinking about the administration of these empires, think about their governance, think about how they use culture, and think about how they get their money. That's pretty important to run a government. We've talked, I've already kind of hit on this a little bit with how culture is used, but in our empires and states of this time period, there certainly are going to be a lot of changes, a lot of belief systems that come about. I'm going to shift over to Europe. In Europe, we're not really at this time, at the start of this time, talking about empires. Later on, we will be by the end of this time period. But there certainly are challenges to religious authority in this time period, especially in Europe. I'm not going to go too into the weeds here, but just keep in mind that in this time period, 1450 to 1750, Europe is going to go through a lot of changes. The Renaissance had come through at the end of the last time period and continued into this one. You'll have the scientific revolution eventually. But one thing that really stands out is the Protestant Reformation. I mentioned earlier that the Roman Catholic Church was really a unifying factor in a fragmented Europe. But that Catholic Church begins to lose authority and begins to break apart during the Protestant Reformation, which is really sparked by Martin Luther, who you see a meme of here. Martin Luther, priest in Germany, takes issue with many issues of the Catholic Church, but chief among them was the sale of indulgences, or a remission of sins, a get out of hell free card, you might want to call it. if you donated to the church, and they were being sold, and there were a lot of corruption around this practice, and he took issue with it. In addition to that, he preached that the Bible alone was needed for salvation, whereas the Catholic Church said Scripture and tradition. Martin Luther believed just Scripture, sola scriptura. Faith alone for salvation, sola fide. The Catholic Church said faith and good works. And maybe worst of all, Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Pope himself, the leader of the Catholic Church, and said the Pope is not all powerful and perhaps shouldn't be in charge. And so that gets kind of a war of some pretty racy political cartoons from the day that are printed at, of course, the major innovation of the time that helps spread these ideas, the printing press, right? Where it's we see these. That's one thing I should have mentioned earlier with the spread of technology, the spread of new inking technologies, the spread of paper, leading the invention of movable type, allowing ideas to spread much more quickly as books become printed very quickly. So this Protestant Reformation leads to a split in the Catholic Church, and churches begin to break away, therefore kind of weakening the Catholic Church. The Catholics respond with a reformation of their own of sorts. The Council of Trent, they agree, okay, selling indulgence is a bad idea. They stop that. But they also create this order of priests known as the Jesuits. And they become significant, not just for being highly educated and meant to send out and correct heresies, but they also become very important for missionary work later in this time period, especially in Asia. So they play a prominent role in converting many people in Japan. I think it was up to like 400,000 people might have converted. So they had tremendous success there, tremendous success in the Philippines, and in some success in China, but eventually are kicked out of Japan and severely restricted in China. Of course, the Catholic Reformation also reaffirms the Pope power and other issues. Maddie asks, I'm seeing here, what was the group of priests called? So it was an order called the Jesuits, Jesuits, also known as, that's a kind of the short name for them. The Society of Jesus is also what they're referred to as. Thank you, Melissa, for chiming in there. Really appreciate it. I spent a little bit longer on that just because it seemed like that was out of left field. So we're going to pull up a map that we've already seen and kind of get into this. So when we think about belief systems in these empires, there are also, and we were talking about political rivals in these empires, religion is very much tied up in that. And so the political rivalry, for example, between the Ottomans and Safavid empires, actually leads to a greater division between religious groups. The split between Sunni and Shia Muslims, which dates back to some of the earliest days of Islam, the split there kind of intensifies and widens. So the gulf between these groups, and you can even see kind of draw some connect the dots between this rivalry and even the split between the Shia-dominated Iran and Sunni-dominated Saudi Arabia today. So we see that split intensify in this time period. Other things that we see coming out of this time period, the Mughal Empire in India being a Muslim empire in a Hindu-dominated land, where we start to see greater blends of Islam and Hinduism in that region, although Hinduism will remain the majority religion. So we see syncretic blends start to develop. One significant one that you need to know from this time period is Sikhism, which again develops in South Asia due to a growing interaction of the Islamic faith and Hinduism. All right, so that's kind of what you need to know about belief systems in this time period. At least the big ideas. Certainly there is more, but we're already at 8 o'clock and I'm still moving, and I'm going to keep going. So keep asking your questions. Stick around as long as you can. Of course, you can access this later if you want to come back to it. That's why we started an hour earlier tonight, because I think Amanda knew what Mr. Lassiter does in review. The last thing we want to do is just kind of keep in mind, think about comparison in land-based empires. Interconnectedness in this time period, 1450 to 1750. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in our next set of, our next unit 4, which we'll review. It's due to global trade, this interconnectedness, and of course it has this major social impact on all of these regions. And so, we see the expansion of the reach and development of religion, whether it's Christianity in the Americas and Asia, the spread of Islam into the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia. But with that expansion, we also see conflict. We've already talked about it with the Ottoman Safavid Sunni Shia split. But we even see conflict in places like Japan, right? I mentioned that Jesuits go and they do missionary work in Japan. There's the great book. I can't remember the author of it, so great, my apologies. But the book Silence, which was made into a movie a few years ago, which deals with the backlash in Japan against this foreign Western religion of Christianity. The Japanese, once they had centralized control of the shogun had centralized control of Japan, began to see this European religion as a threat. If are Roman Catholic or converted to Roman Catholicism, and they're loyal to a pope way over in Rome, then they're not loyal to the emperor of Japan. And so there's a great purge of Christianity, and Japan will close itself off from Europe for the most part, except the Dutch. And they keep liking the Dutch. One thing that sparks that is they look at an example of the Philippines. The Philippines is not that far from Japan, and the Spanish come, they spread Christianity, and they take over the islands of the Philippines. And Japan didn't want that to happen. So again, furthermore, if we want to think about this, we see syncretic practices throughout the world. The picture here on the left is of Sikhism. Sufi practices. So we think about that syncretic practice occurring in India and spreading from there. The spread of Islam through Sufi practices. Many Sufi practices of kind of mystical religion are adopted in Southeast Asia. And Christianity is, we haven't really gotten to the idea of Europeans arriving in the Americas yet, which we're about to. But when Christianity spreads to the Americas, there are a lot of syncretic blends that emerge. For example, Our Lady of Guadalupe, which I believe the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe is coming up. I think it's December 12th, next week, the day we have the Game of Fives. So there's your plug for that again. But Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is kind of a syncretic blend of Mexican traditions and Christianity. Other examples would be like Vodun, which combines, when we see the arrival of slaves in the Americas, the forced migration and brutality of slavery, which we'll talk about in just a moment. We see the blends of African culture with Christianity. And so Vodun, Santeria, things like that are good examples of syncretic practices that occur across empires in this time period. All right. So there is a question in here. Annabelle asks, in what ways were land-based empires different in the ways imperial rulers consolidated and legitimized power? So different from each other. So you can look at differences in for example, this would be a really great comparison essay. Think about different ways that they consolidated power. You could focus on their use of different religions. You could focus on the different methods of tax collection. You could focus on government structure. I haven't gone too much into that, but maybe if you've covered it with your teachers, those might be ways to highlight their differences. And then you could certainly highlight similarities in their use of art and architecture, things like that. So really great question. Man, I wish we had time to do like LEQ style stuff from all of this. But I think it would be a good essay question. All right. Now let's think about this last unit, Unit 4. And Unit 4 is a beast. Trans-Oceanic Interconnections is what it's called. I tend to think of it as the first global era. where we actually see trade going across the oceans, particularly the Atlantic, Europeans getting involved in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean trade networks, the development of a Pacific Ocean trade network. This map I'm going to show you several times. Mr. Beckman provided it for me. I think it was maybe Melissa may have somebody else used it in their presentation, and so Eric can give credit where credit is due here. But man, it's so much is shown on this map. We have empires, we have trade routes, we have major cities, we have goods that are traded here. So I'll leave it up for a moment if you want to take a good old screenshot. This is just rich with information, so I'm going to keep bringing it up again and again, or coming back to it. As we see the increase of empires, Bram Hubble, let's give him a shout out, sharing it on Twitter. That's great. So as we see these empires expand, and we see trade expand further in this time period, and then we'll see, as we'll talk about momentarily, the expansion of the Atlantic trade network and Europeans getting involved in the Indian Ocean. We're going to see greater influences of these empires around the world. We're going to see greater centralization. We're going to see people wielding more power. And of course, that means we're going to see some conflict come out of it as well. So let's just keep those things in mind. Again, we'll come back to these ideas. But when we're thinking about trans-oceanic interconnections, we want to think about how those came about. So we're going to start thinking about technology. We'll talk about the causes and events that come about with exploration. We're going to talk about the effects of the Columbian Exchange, what maritime empires look like, how states were challenged, changing social hierarchies, and then we'll end with a little bit of changing continuity in this time period. So first, let's talk a bit about technology. All of this, especially from time period 2 or unit time, whatever the last time period was, 1200 to 1450, all of those connections that were being made in trade are going to be extremely important for allowing for these trans-oceanic interconnections here, this maritime trade, particularly cross-cultural interaction. That will facilitate the diffusion of technology. Classical, Islamic, Asian knowledge will spread in this time period. The use of mathematics, philosophy, science, especially astronomy and medicine, they spread along trade networks. And what that results in are new tools being available, the astrolabe, the compass, and they'll be improved upon kind of as they move along these trade networks. The use of the lateen sail, which had been very commonly in use for, I don't know, I want to say thousands of years, but somebody might correct me, in the Indian Ocean, will be added to the square sails of European ships in new ship styles, new ship designs like the caravel, which you see pictured here, the carrack, the flute, these ships that were made to be ocean going in the harsh waters of the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, but also made to carry a lot of goods with them. Typically, caravels were tinier than many ships that people saw in the Indian Ocean, but they were highly maneuverable. They also put cannons on them and could use those to bombard cities. Other tools that were used, new astronomical charts, right? Using mathematics and the science of astronomy to better navigate, make it much more efficient. The more efficient travel is, the more you can trade. The use of mapping winds, which, we think, well, you want to map out land. Well, mapping typical wind patterns allows for Europeans, for example, to travel faster to India as they learn that they can, maybe not hugging the coast of Africa, but kind of swinging out wide is the best way to go. And so Europeans have to figure these things out, and they're not developing it on their own. They are building on the shoulders of these civilizations and of this cultural transfer that has been around for quite some time. So we have this new technology, and it's going to come together, and we're going to see exploration. And that age of exploration and the global era is really kicked off by state-supported ventures, state-supported exploration. And it begins in Portugal and Spain. They're going to take the lead in this. Later on, we'll have England, France, Netherlands, blah, 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 blah. But Portugal is going to lead it off. And they start with their schools of navigation. You might have heard the term Henry the Navigator here. He is, opens up these schools of navigation so that the Portuguese can start exploring the coast of Africa. If we want to get into why that is, because they don't want to trade through Muslim middlemen, the Ottoman Empire, which is growing in power. The Portuguese don't want to deal with them. So what do? We want to access the riches of the world our own way. We can, access gold in West Africa and not have to trade with Muslim middlemen in Morocco. We can go get it ourselves. And then as they get better over time, realizing that, hey, why don't we just go get spices from India on our own too, rather than relying on the Venetians to trade with the Muslims who are trading with people in India, who are trading with people in Southeast Asia. Right? Cut out the middlemen, pay much less, profit, right? So they improve on some of the tech tools, some of the navigation, navigational tools. They begin with that exploration of the west coast of Africa. The Portuguese will round the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. Vasco da Gama reaches India in 1498, only 6 years after Columbus discovers the Americas. And as a result, the Portuguese basically, and through a treaty with Spain, where ultimate example of hubris is they divide the world between Spain and Portugal by order of the Pope. Portugal has kind of access to the Indian Ocean, and there they begin to establish a maritime empire. Now, this isn't necessarily a contiguous empire. They don't have total control of trade, although they do take over very important port cities. And so we refer to the Portuguese Empire in the Indian Ocean as a trading post empire. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. Here are some of the Portuguese men I was talking about: Henry the Navigator, Diaz, and da Gama pictured here. But we definitely have state-supported trade. Just like Portugal is the state of Portugal supporting trade, Spain does the same thing. And so they pay this guy Columbus, this Italian, who says that he can sail to India by going west. Many people, I want to dispel any myths that people thought the earth was flat, because it isn't. And people knew the earth was round. They just assumed that it would take far too long to sail westward, and that you just wouldn't possibly be able to survive. Well, little did they know there was a whole bunch of land between the two. And so Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella sponsor Columbus and others in their exploration of the Atlantic and later the Pacific Ocean. Magellan, for example, which you see on this map, you can see his circumnavigation of the globe. He doesn't make it all the way around, but one of his ships does. And so that exploration is, again, sponsored by the state. It is the basis for Spanish claim to the Americas and then also to the Philippines. And of course, will allow for the Spanish to access the great supplies of silver that are in the Americas and that will fuel trade in this time period. Columbus's discoveries in the Americas lead to a much higher interest in trade by other European countries, particularly England, France, and the Netherlands. And they will begin their own exploration of the North Atlantic and begin to establish their own empires in the Americas as well, especially in the Caribbean and North America. So this is really kind of how our modern global era kicks off. This, what we oftentimes just call the Age of Exploration, again, led by Portugal and Spain. Others follow suit. Now, what are the consequences then of this trade? Well, especially when we think about Columbus's voyage to the Americas, we'll talk about that first, and then we'll talk about more on empires in a little bit. The most significant consequence is the Columbian Exchange. Now, I want to note one thing. The Columbian Exchange is not a trade route. It is a process by which the Eastern and Western hemispheres are connected and become more homogeneous in terms of their biodiversity. They exchange plants and animals and diseases between the two, and which is quite significant in the development of both culture in the Americas and in Afro-Eurasia. So when we think about the transfer of all of these things, I just want to start by talking about disease. With Europeans comes disease vectors like rats and mosquitoes with catastrophic results. Europeans bring over diseases that are endemic to Afro-Eurasia and aren't quite as devastating, but they bring them to the Americas, and Amerindians simply have no natural defenses to these diseases. And so smallpox, measles, influenza wipes out massive numbers of Native Americans. I think, the percentages vary, but something around the 90% estimated deaths in the Americas from these European diseases, which leads to a drastic population reduction, of course, in the Americas. And it is one of the reasons why Europeans can so easily conquer it. Although easy is a relative term. But it is the reason why Europeans are able to conquer the Americas, and they're not going to have that same advantage in, say, India or Southeast Asia or China. It's going to be some time before they can actually get a foothold there. Beyond that, of course, is the transfer of food, plants, animals. American foods become staples in the Eastern Hemisphere. I can't overstate this. The diets of people in Afro-Eurasia become much more diverse, leading to much healthier much healthier people. Nutritional benefits of a diverse diet means you live a longer, healthier life, which means populations are going to increase too as foodstuffs are brought from the Americas. Stuff like corn, potatoes, beans, tomatoes, things of that nature. Afro-Eurasian foods also move to the Americas as well. Fruit trees, grains, and probably the biggest crop, because it will become a cash crop, is sugarcane, which comes in and begins to be grown in Brazil and the Caribbean. But another thing that comes to the Americas are domesticated animals, which have drastic environmental consequences. Horses, cattle, and especially pigs have a large effect on the Americas. Amerindians do not have beasts of burden like they did in Europe, so that is going to make a shift in how agriculture works in the Americas. But animals like pigs, which procreate very rapidly, they will change the landscape of the Americas. Other foodstuffs are brought from Afro-Eurasia, and some are transferred in enforced migration. So the African slave trade, for example, where we see a forced movement of African slaves to the Americas to be forced into labor on plantations. With that comes varieties of rice and okra into the Americas. And it is cash crops which really help generate profits for these new empires in the Americas. Tobacco, sugarcane especially, they're typically grown with coerced labor, first with enslaved natives, but because of the effects of disease, Europeans turn for a time to indentured servants, but they realize the work sucks and they stop coming. And so Europeans turn to chattel slavery, the kidnapping of people from their homelands in Africa and forced into labor in the Americas to turn a profit for European plantation owners. All right. So seeing some consequences of the Columbian Exchange there. Again, not a trade route, but an exchange of these goods and plants and animals between these two regions of the world for the first time. As we see an increase in trade, as we see an increase in maritime trade in this time period, we see new empires develop. Maritime empires, different sort of from what we've been talking about with those land-based empires. So trading posts, I mentioned earlier the Portuguese establishing trading post empires, especially in Africa and Asia. And you see some of the cities here that the Dutch and Portuguese traded in. So the Portuguese especially tried to dominate trade in the Indian Ocean. The thing is, trade is so plentiful and so widespread, and there's so much volume. The Portuguese really don't have the manpower to control it like they want. And so what they end up doing are dedicating themselves to controlling very specific cities that are important for trade. Cities like Goa in India, cities on the Swahili coast of Africa. And what we end up seeing is a great deal of European influence over trade in Asia eventually, by the end of this time period especially. That is not the case everywhere. There certainly are reactions to this trade. For example, China adopts kind of a more isolationist policy. Eventually, the Ming China and the Qing dynasty later established the Canton system. So all trade, outside trade, goes through one strictly controlled port city. In Japan, where they had been trading with Europeans for a time, they restrict trade to one location. And they really only, after expelling the Europeans, only trade with one country, and that is the Dutch, who they feel they can trust to just trade and make money and not have any other nefarious agenda. They also kind of keep an eye on the outside world through this, so they're not totally isolated in the fact that they refer to kind of the textbooks and the information they get from the outside world as Dutch learning. But in this time period, so as we see these maritime empires be established, and I'm realizing as I'm looking at this beautiful map once again that really I haven't covered the Russian Empire at all in this. So hopefully we have a video on that. Maybe Melissa or one of our teachers can chime in. Eric, maybe if we've had a video specifically on Russia. I know I haven't done it. Anyways, empires, these maritime empires are driven by political, religious, and economic reasons, right? So a desire, a competition with one another, with political, searching for political power by adding land and adding resources to their empire. Religious competition, in some senses, there's still kind of a Protestant Catholic divide in Europe, and that's important. Religious competition with non-Christians as well, and then of course economic rivalry and the desire to make money. And so the empires that really stand out in this time period from Europe are the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, and the British. Those 5 countries are ones I usually have people focus on. But that doesn't mean that only European countries benefited from the expansion of this trade. In fact, the expansion of trade leads to the growth of powerful states in places like Africa, the Kingdom of Asante in West Africa, which you can see on this map, basically where Ghana is now, the Kingdom of Benin, and the Kingdom of Congo in the present day kind of DRC. Those kingdoms develop in Africa as important trade centers with the Portuguese and then later European traders. Some were quite powerful, and when Europeans did not go along with their method of trade, they expel Europeans, and then others aren't so lucky, and they are kind of weakened by this trade. One thing that that comes about in this time, and we need to really consider as well with our maritime empires, excuse me, are the economic systems that come along with them. Overall, the growth of these European maritime empires is a disrupting factor in how trade had occurred in the Indian Ocean, especially and certainly within Africa for hundreds of years. Overall, trade does flourish in the existing Indian Ocean, but with some disruption. Excuse me. So Europeans come in, shake things up, to put it into the least or like the most understated way we could say it. But ultimately, there is flourishing trade in these networks. Swahili Arabs, Omanis in the Middle East, Gujaratis, the Javanese of Southeast Asia, they all participate in this trade. And generally, we see a flourishing of trade and an increase in trade and wealth in this time period, especially with the influx of silver coming from the Americas via the Spanish. But of course, those economic systems are built on the backs of people and specific labor systems, especially labor systems in the Americas that are kind of a dark part of our history, right? For the Spanish, it was the use of the encomienda and hacienda system in Mesoamerica, the use of the midas system to mine silver in South America. And the midas system was a form of labor as a tax that was developed by the Inca. The Spanish adopt it, and then, in a way, you could say overuse it, which ends up, of course, devastating Incan culture. But this use of labor to extract wealth from the Americas. Beyond that, chattel slavery, the use of slavery, the idea of people as chattel, as property, as beasts of burden would be used. Europeans kidnap people from Africa and take them to the Americas and force them into working in this way, in a very brutal form of hereditary slavery. Now, that's not to say slavery did not continue elsewhere. There was still slavery in Africa and the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. That continues throughout this time period. But the growth of the plantation economy in the Americas, especially the production of sugar, that's going to lead to the increasing demand for slaves and the expansion of slave culture in the Americas, and is an extremely important factor in this time period, and it continues into our next time period, 1750 to 1900. Slavery doesn't end in the Western Hemisphere until the 1880s. And of course, the effects, the ramifications of that are still being felt. It seems an hour and a half is about where my voice is giving out. But we have a little bit more to go. I'll power through. Of course, with the institution of slavery, we see a lot of demographic, social, and cultural changes in Africa. We see women taking on much greater roles in the society, as most slaves tended to be men. In the Americas, we've already talked about the syncretic religious practices that develop. And we also see new race-based hierarchies, which I'll talk about in a little while. Once these maritime empires and systems have been established, then they needed to be maintained and developed. And one way that Europeans maintained this was through economic policy. How did they make sure their wealth that they were generating stayed within their empire, right? We looked at land-based empires. Money and wealth was important for centralizing control. Well, that's the same case with these maritime empires, although they're generating that wealth maybe a little differently. And so with their economic policy, they have this policy of mercantilism. And that is the idea that trade was done through chartered joint stock companies, these companies that would share risk. The government would grant them a charter. Especially England was known for doing this. The Dutch were known for doing this. The Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company. They would grant a charter, and then the charter would have a monopoly on trade in a region. And everyone who wanted goods from India had to go through the British East India Company. If you wanted tea, you had to go through in the Netherlands, you had to go through the Dutch East India Company. So that economic policy is going to predominate or dominate in Europe. There are rivalries, of course, that developed from this, especially among Europeans. The English and Spanish had a major rivalry, culminating in the Spanish Armada being defeated in 1588, which was a devastating blow for Spain, and really buoyed the prospects for England, which will kind of be on an upward trajectory at the end of this time period. But there were also conflicts outside of Europe. For example, there was a Muslim and European rivalry in the Indian Ocean, especially Portuguese and Omani traders. I think I have that right. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong here. So that's important to know as well. Empires had to be maintained. Typically, they did that through their economic policy, and certainly through trade. And that trade, and we've kind of been dancing around it. The trade is really centered on the Atlantic system, which becomes, by the end of this time period, the dominant trade network in the world. So we see the movement of goods, wealth, and labor. The movement of tobacco and sugar, for example, from the Americas, silver from the Americas, which really becomes a global currency. It's going to be used all over the world. China's going to be gobbling up silver. You probably talked about that a good deal. Silver is going to pay for the Taj Mahal, basically. It is going to be a currency used all around the world, the Spanish peso de ocho being kind of that main coin. But also, of course, the Atlantic system sees this triangle slave trade, right, that we've been talking about tonight. There's also a global circulation of goods chartered, that is supported by this silver. And that's going to lead to an increase in production. Peasant and artisan labor is going to intensify. They got to meet the needs of trade. Wool and linen being produced in Europe, cotton in India, silk in China, porcelain. There's going to be more emphasis on those things in order to meet the trade needs. As a result, too, as these empires are being established, for example, the Spanish Empire is dealing with something they had never dealt with before. Really, they're a very diverse cultural element in the Americas: African culture, native culture, Spanish culture. So, how then do empires deal with that and maintain their control? We see new social hierarchies develop. In Spanish-held territories, it was the castas system, which put its citizen into castes or into a social hierarchy based on race, and how white or non-white one was. Of course, there are going to be other cultural changes as well, conflicts in some regions between different cultures, syncretic beliefs, syncretic development or religious practices, which we've talked about already tonight, will develop. So a lot of these cultural changes, and don't forget, of course, the cultural changes that are taking place in Africa, which is a victim of this slave trade, family restructuring taking place. Now, that's not to say people did not challenge European empires. There certainly was challenges to state power. In Spanish America, there were the Pueblo revolts. In British America, King Philip's War, Metacom's War is what it's also known as. You see the picture here. Anna Nzinga resisted to increasing Portuguese power in what is present-day Angola, even encouraging guerrilla tactics to fight against Portuguese influence in the region. Within other countries, there were, even within some land-based empires, there was resistance to state expansion, centralization, whether it's the Cossack revolts, which were first kind of against Poland and then later against Russia as Russia grew in power, the Marathas in the Mughal Empire, even revolts in France. I've talked a little bit about changing social hierarchies with the Spanish, but I do want to get into some others that you may want to know, and I'm going to go through these really quickly. The Mughal and Ottomans, regions with religious and ethnic diversity, they use that in some ways to strengthen their empire economically and politically, taking advantage of religious diversity for the Dev-Sherme system and the like. Other states support, some states don't support diversity, like Spain, while others will. For example, Jews are expelled from Spain and Portugal. They're accepted in the Ottoman Empire. Some states, like the Manchu Qing dynasty, restrict Han Chinese rights in the Qing Empire. We see new political elites emerging in this time period, whether it's in the casta systems of the Americas, whether it's the Manchu in China, In some places, we see existing elites just confronting new challenges. Power kind of fluctuates. For example, the European nobility go through kind of power fluctuation. For sake of time, as we're getting right here close to the end, I'm already past the 8:30 mark, which actually where in the back of my head I thought I was actually going to finish, but apparently I did not. So we're going to just move on and kind of focus instead on this continuity and change here at the end. So I want us to kind of reflect on I told you this Trans-Oceanic Interconnections. It's a beast. There's a lot here. Hopefully we've at least jogged your memory, or at least got you thinking about stuff that you feel like you know well and stuff that you feel like you know less well. And hopefully that will help you hone in and decide what maybe you need to study as you come to kind of this midterm end of the semester. So when we think about continuity and change, first I want to consider that in this time period, we do see this growing interconnectedness, right? Which will transform, or that's a fancy word for change, trade. It will have major social impacts, right? The transfer of knowledge and technology will lead to many of these changes. Along the way, some things stay the same, like agriculture, right? Agriculture remains an important part of the global experience. We're not yet to the Industrial Revolution. Agriculture is going to be the moneymaker. It's going to be what people focus on. However, when we think about agriculture, labor systems change, right? And how money is made through agriculture, right? We're going to see cash crops become much more important than we had seen in the past. The use of slavery, the use of the Mida system, the use of encomienda system, which eventually is outlawed and replaced with the hacienda system, which isn't that much better. Those are going to be extremely important. Other changes that we see are as a result of this era of trade, intensification of many different types of labor, whether it's peasant labor in China and India, in producing silk or cotton, whether it's systems of and locations of manufacturing in China and India to meet the demand of trade, producing goods for Europeans, like, I don't know, inlaid boxes, stuff like that. Some of you will get that. So that's going to change. As I've already mentioned, social structures in the Americas, gender and family structures in Africa, that's going to be a change that we see, a social change as a result of this first global era. And of course, environmental changes. Columbian Exchange, massive environmental changes. The movement of people to the Americas, the growth of cash crops, and what that does to the environment of the Caribbean islands, the spread of disease, all of those things, major factors here. Of course, empires change as well. We see an increase in the scope and influence of empires. We see an increase in the diversity of empires, especially European empires. And by the end of this time period, we're going to see much more economic conflict, especially in the Indian Ocean, where no one group had ever really dominated trade there. And now Europeans enter the Indian Ocean trade in this time period, and that is going to lead to conflict, not just between Europeans and people trading in that region, but between Europeans themselves. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, AP World History students, we have finished our 4 time periods in slightly over an hour and a half, but I did give some announcements at the beginning, so I'm calling it an hour and a half. But that means that we have some time perhaps for questions, for thinking about these questions and answering them. And definitely want to, if you have any here that have not already been answered by our fantastic faculty and streamers in the staff, then feel free to pose them now. We've also had a couple really great questions in the question box there. There was a question about going over kind of syncretism, and we covered that tonight. So thinking about Vodun, Santeria as syncretic blends of religion. Thinking about the casta system, and in the question even itself has some really great knowledge about it and how that casta system worked. At the top of that casta system were peninsulares. Those are people who were born in Spain. They were Europeans born in Europe. The next rung were Creoles. They were Europeans. You would consider them full Spanish, except the fact they were born in the Americas. And then you have mestizos, who were mixed between Spanish and Native American, and mulattoes between Spanish and African and Africans, and then on down the line. And so these very highly, I would say specialized, it might not be the right word, but very specific social hierarchy really was significant in Spanish America, especially in a way for the upper classes, the plantation owners, really to maintain control. So the other question was about maritime empires, which we've gone over extensively and maybe so much that people are not happy, but thank you for the question, Mandy, there. Thank you for everybody who has been here tonight, has stuck it out. I know that we went long. Again, if you have any other questions you'd like to throw up in the chat, I'll hang on for a couple more minutes to answer those. And if it's something I can't answer, we might bring somebody up. So it's been really great having you all. Know that while I didn't really stick to what I wanted to, and with really being brief, I know I went into a lot more detail when we got to our unit 4. But for these topics, we have corresponding past streams that are archived on our Fiveable site. If you're interested in joining, you'll have access to all of those. So definitely make sure that you check those out, whether it's getting more information on Indian Ocean maritime trade, or medieval China, or Russia, or the Mongols, which we had some really fantastic streams on. Definitely make sure that you check those out. We've had streams this year, all of those regions of the world I covered, 1200 to 1450. We had specific streams on those, specific streams on Africa and South Asia, on the Dar al-Islam. Donald did that one. Southeast Asia was hosted by Eric, so some really fantastic stuff there. Even in our last unit, we had, I hosted one on labor systems. Trans-Oceanic Connections was done by Allie. Donald covered social hierarchies. And I'm blanking on some of the stuff. Melissa's been doing a lot of good work with writing practice, so you can have some of that if you need to go back and look at any of that. So make sure that you check it out. Eric coming through with the link there on fiveable.me/AP World. And so if you just want to figure out what we're doing, definitely try it out. No questions are populating, which means that this incredible team of streamers that are interacting with you live must have answered all of them for you. And so with that, at 8:45, hour 45, only 15 minutes over what I really thought it would take tonight. So I'm going to give myself a pat on the back for that one. We're done. Best of luck. Don't forget to join us next week, 1 week from today, on the 12th. We will be having the game of fives. So you can put all of your knowledge to the test and kick the butts of anybody who may have missed this presentation. Thank you for everybody who hung on to the end. It's been really great. Judy, Eric, Shreya, Chloe, Alex, Jacob, Lady, Trevor, Michael, Nicholas, Marietta, Annabelle, Logan, Cade, Hawaii, trying to shout out everybody on here. NS, who has just initials, which is great. So thank you so much for being here tonight, and best of luck. See you later.